We've been thinking from the beginning of the mission of God as that which provides an overarching structure and unifying understanding of the whole Bible. God is engaged in mission, and we saw that that flows from God with a mission, humanity with a mission, Israel with a mission, Christ with a mission, the church with a mission. The whole Bible can be framed around that particular structure. But then we spent some time in our first couple of classes thinking about the creational dimension of that, so that we don't lose or miss the and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22 see the creational dimension and its ecological implications. And then this morning we were looking at some aspects of what it means to be the people of God committed to mission. Again, largely from the Old Testament, but with a number of New Testament echoes, parallels. And we were thinking about how we are the covenant. We have a unique experience as God's covenant people of God's revelation and God's redemption, as in the case of the Exodus and Sinai experience of Israel, echoed by 1 Peter and 1 Peter 2, that we are a people committed to walking in the ways of the Lord so that God will keep his promise to Abraham, Genesis 18 verse 19, and a people who are called to be God's priesthood in the world, as we were thinking of in Exodus 19 verse 6. So what I'm hoping has begun to filter through is that there is a lot more to thinking missiologically about the Bible than just finding a few obvious missionary verses, of which, of course, there are plenty. But it's not just those verses about evangelism or church planting which are missiologically important. That as you explore some of these other texts about who God was, who God's people are, and those kind of things, that it also emphasis. And that's what I want to do now as we look at what I've called the scope of mission. What does our mission include? How big is our understanding of our mission? Well, our mission, the size of our mission depends on our understanding of the size of our gospel. And the size of our gospel depends rather on the size of what we understand by the word redemption. Since God is in the redemption business, we need to understand what does the Bible mean by such things as redemption when it uses that kind of language. And so what I want us to do is, at least in this session, is certainly to think about the Exodus as God's model of redemption. We may or may not have time to move on to thinking also about the Jubilee, which is on the following page. We'll just see how we get there. We'll leave that till tomorrow morning. Because when you ask the question, our minds tend instinctively to think immediately in Pauline terms, the redemption of the New Testament, redeemed through the blood of Christ, bought by the blood of Christ out of slavery and so on. It's a New Testament metaphor for atonement and salvation, which we know and are familiar with and find in many of our songs and hymns and so on. But of course, if you were to step back, as we've been trying to do in this course, back to the Old Testament, and sort of sidle up to some Old Testament farmer, some Israelite on his land and say, "Excuse me, brother, are you redeemed?" Well, that's the way you'd have asked it if you were in Northern Ireland, as I am. Evangelists on the street would say that to you. "Are you redeemed? Are you saved?" Okay. Well, if you'd said that to an Israelite, he'd have said, "Yeah, of course I am." And if you'd said, "How do you know?" he'd say, "Well, where do you think I'm standing? I'm here in God's land, because my fathers were slaves in Egypt, but God brought us out of there and brought us here. That's how I'm redeemed. I know that I'm part of the people of God whom he redeemed out of Egypt and brought into this land." Redemption is of the very essence of the Old Testament story. It's what constituted them as the people of God. That kind of language is even there in Deuteronomy 26. That's why I chose an Israelite farmer, because that's who you probably would have met if you just wandered about. But it says, "When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance and taken possession of it, take some of the first fruits of what you produced from the soil of the land the Lord your God has given you, put it in a basket, take it to the sanctuary, and you put it down before the priest, and you declare before the Lord, 'My father was a wandering Aramean,'" that's Jacob, "and he went down into Egypt with a few people. He lived there, became a great nation, powerful and numerous. The Egyptians ill-treated us, made us suffer, putting us to hard labor, but we We cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice, saw our misery and toil and oppression, and the Lord brought us up out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with terror, miraculous signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, O Lord, have given me. Place the basket before the Lord and worship him there. That's the Israelite harvest festival. And the Israelite farmer there can bind together about 5 centuries history in his great confession of what it means to be an Israelite redeemed on God's, living in God's land. So we need to go back there and ask the question then, in what sense was the Exodus a model of redemption? The first thing to say here is that it's actually called redemption in the Song of Moses, as I referred briefly to this morning in Exodus chapter 15. When Moses has brought the Israelites across the Red Sea, he and his big sister Miriam break out into praise and song, and Moses speaks of the event in the language of redemption, and says there in verse 13, in your unfailing love, O Lord, you will lead the people you have redeemed. That's, apart from God's promise in Exodus 6, the first use of the redemption language, except the brief use of it in Genesis 45. But this is the first major significant use of it in this poem, this ancient poem of Moses, is that the event which we call the Exodus is being described through the metaphor of redeeming, redemption. So we need to ask, what did the word mean in Old Testament terms? And I've given you here a little bit of Hebrew just on the page so you can show off to your friends sometime. Ga'al is the verb to redeem, and go'el is the noun. That means a redeemer. So you ga'al, that means you redeem, and if you do the ga'al work, then you are a go'el, you are a redeemer. And this was a verb and a noun which is thoroughly rooted in Israel's social and economic life. Basically, a go'el was a kinsman, a member of your family, not necessarily the immediate family, just a brother, but it could be a brother, but it could be a wider kinsman, a cousin, within the family. And in any situation where somebody in the family was in trouble, for a variety of reasons, if another member of the family comes along and acts on behalf of the person who is in trouble, then that acting kinsman becomes the go'el. He's the kinsman redeemer. In fact, that's how the word is sometimes translated in the NIV, kinsman redeemer. It's a family member who does whatever it takes to get a fellow kinsman out of trouble. Now, maybe in some cases he can't get the kinsman out of trouble, because if the kinsman happens to have been killed or murdered, then all he can do is avenge him. But that's one of the ways. In fact, in Numbers 35, verse 12, it's clear that that's one of the ways the word is used, that if someone has been murdered, then it is the responsibility of a kinsman, somebody within the family, to act as his go'el. That is, to seek out the murderer and to bring him to justice. Not to just kill him in a kind of feud or vengeance, but to see that he faces justice, to bring him to justice. That's a go'el. So the first role of a go'el is to avenge blood, or the avenger of blood, as he's sometimes called. Another little humorous aside, you'll be getting fed up with them before the end of the week, but when I was in India, teaching in India years ago, all my handout notes were laboriously typed by a woman in the office, and I had written that the first function of a go'el is to avenge blood, and she miswrote go'el as G-O-A-L, a goal. And so what was written on the thing was, the first function of a goal is to avenge blood. And I thought, well, that's probably true in some sports, but it wasn't quite what I meant. So that's one. A second use of the go'el redemption language is redeeming land or slaves that have been lost through debt. When we come to look at the law of Jubilee tomorrow, I think it will probably be tomorrow now, in Leviticus 25, that's the reference to put down, Leviticus 25, there the language of Goel is riddled right through that chapter. So if you are an Israelite farmer and you're falling into poverty, perhaps your harvests aren't good, something's going wrong, and you need to sell some of your land or to use some of your land as a collateral to get a loan in order to plant next year's seed, which would be the normal thing, so that you would, some of your land would, as it were, be up for sale as a collateral for what you could then invest in the future. Then it was the duty of a kinsman to come along and gaal that land, redeem it, preempt it, buy it, in order to keep it within the family, so that it wouldn't be sold outside the family. Or if that had gone on for some time and you hadn't been able to get back on your feet and you had to actually sell some of your dependents into slavery to pay off your debt. And that was also perfectly legal in Israel. So if I happen to be in debt here to this other Chris sitting in front, and I can't pay my debt, and I've got no more land that I can mortgage or anything like that, I might say, well, I've got a very healthy young son, Tim. I tell you what, I'll send him to you and he'll work for you and he will pay off my debt. So effectively my son becomes a dependent, debt-bonded slave to my now there are various regulations as to how he's to be treated, but that's a situation where my son is enslaved because of my debt, to pay off my debt. Now if that happens, then the law comes in and says that it is the duty of a kinsman, some other relative, where possible, to redeem that person, to pay for his freedom, to bring him back into the family. And if the situation goes on and he's not redeemed, well, in any case, in the Jubilee year, he will be released. That was the law of Jubilee. So redemption also applied to land and to slaves, and even to wives and deceased husbands. And that's not written down here, but in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10, there is the law which legislates in relation to what you were to do or what was supposed to happen if a man in Israel died without having a son. And if that were to happen, then it was the duty, the moral duty, although it was never seems to be enforceable or penalizable, the moral duty of a brother or a kinsman to take the widow of the deceased brother and to seek to have children by her, or at least a son by her, and that son would inherit the name and the property of the deceased husband. It's called levirate marriage, brother-in-law marriage. And although it's not called redemption, Gaal, in Deuteronomy, that language is used in the most prominent example of that happening, which is in the book of Ruth, in Ruth chapter 4. Well, actually in chapters 3 and 4, do you remember that Ruth goes to Boaz and asks him to act as Goel for her and Naomi. In fact, more for Naomi than for her, because it was Elimelech who had died, and it was Elimelech's property that was in danger of being lost to his family. And so what Boaz does is that he both redeems the land that had belonged to Elimelech and takes Ruth as his wife, knowing that any son initially born to Ruth will not be his, but Elimelech's. And that's why the other kinsman, the nearer kinsman, resists, doesn't do it. You remember in chapter 4, when the land is up for sale, the other kinsman, I'll have that, that's great, I can redeem. When he hears that he has to take Ruth as well, he says, oh, no, I don't think I can do that. Not because he didn't fancy Ruth, it wasn't, that wasn't the issue at all. It was because of the financial commitment of raising a son that actually wouldn't inherit his property, but Elimelech's property. So it was a very strong, costly financial commitment to act as a Goel. And that's why Boaz is so commended. That's why he shows his faithfulness, his righteousness in taking that risk, and then is rewarded for it, of course, in the fact that he doesn't just have one son, but other sons, who would then, of course, be his. So that's the language of redemption in the Old Testament. That's the Old Testament verb, Gaal and Goel. So you see, when Old Testament texts, here in Exodus and very strongly in Isaiah, that's the place where the redemption language comes even more powerfully, when Yahweh is portrayed as Israel's Goel, Redeemer of Israel, it's a very rich metaphor. It means that here is the one who takes upon himself a commitment to Israel as strong as any family commitment you can imagine, brother to brother. This is, in a sense, a blood relationship that God is taking upon himself with his people. And it's also a commitment in which God is prepared to do whatever it takes to defend, to rescue Israel from whatever the problem is. He's their goel. And so he will pay whatever the cost, he will exert whatever energy, he will work with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm, as the texts say, because he is the goel, he is going to act. So are the Israelites in danger of murder, or suffering murder? Well, yes, they were. In Egypt, they were suffering genocide. God is their goel. God will rescue them out of the place of death in Egypt. Are they in a situation of land loss? Well, yes, they were. They were in a land that wasn't even their own. And they were working and laboring as slaves. And Yahweh is their goel, and he will deliver them from that. Are they in danger of not having sons to inherit them? Yes, they are, because the Egyptians are slaughtering their little baby boys in Exodus 1. And so Yahweh will step in, you see, to give them posterity, to remove them from that situation of death and loss. He is their goel. That's the flavor of this language of redemption in the Old Testament. I hope that is helpful in just giving you, as it were, a richer, fuller biblical understanding of what it means to speak about God as our Redeemer and to speak about redemption in holistic biblical terms, rather than only thinking immediately of the kind of imagery that we get with the Apostle Paul, which of course was primarily the slave market, the redemption of slaves in the Roman context. But this is taking it back to the Old Testament. Okay. So if the Exodus then is an act of Geulah, of God acting as Goel for Israel, what did God do? What did the Exodus consist of? And that's where it's important, I think, to explore those early chapters of Exodus for all that they are worth, for all that is in them, and to read them with adult eyes and ears, not just, as it were, through the perspective of perhaps the 10-year-old children that we were when we first heard the story of Moses and the bulrushes and so on as children. Well, I'm only speaking for myself, but I do recall how often I found myself as I studied the Scriptures, particularly reading theology, and having eye-opening experiences where stories that I'd known as a child, because I was brought up in a Christian home, which had been basically Bible storybook stories, suddenly coming to life in an adult way. I mean, I'd always read the story of the suffering of the Hebrews in Egypt and Moses and the bulrushes and all, but it always was in that storybook mentality. And somehow when you read these stories again, adult thinking in comparison to our contemporary world and the kind of reality that's being described here, then it takes on a much more horrendous aspect. So, for example, the Israelites in this chapter are in a state of bondage, which is at one level political. The Israelites were an immigrant ethnic minority people. They had initially gone down to Egypt, of course, as economic migrants out of famine, and they had been granted asylum by the then Pharaoh. You remember the stories of Joseph and so on back in the end of Genesis. And Egypt is commended for that. In fact, in one of the laws in Deuteronomy says, do not abhor an Egyptian because they gave you shelter in their land. So although there are pretty nasty things said about Egypt in many parts of the Old Testament, the memory was still there that in their need, when they were about to die out, when they were down to their very last sheep, as Joseph and his multicolored musical puts it, that it was Egypt that rescued them. So they'd gone down to Egypt as economic migrants, but then, as happens, the situation changes, history moves on, there arises a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and the host nation becomes a very unwelcoming place. And they exist now in a state that is vulnerable to oppression and exploitation because they have no political freedom. They are an immigrant minority people with no statehood, no power, no force of their own. So they were in a political bondage. But that political non-freedom seems to have only become truly problematic when it was expressed in the form of economic exploitation. And what Exodus 1 describes is how the Pharaoh recognizes that these Israelites are becoming too many. Look, he says, the Israelites have become much too numerous for them. There's far too many of them in our country. How does that sound today? These immigrants, there are too many of them. We need to deal cleverly with them, otherwise they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. This is the enemy within. You know, these are the people who've got loyalty outside here. That's again a very modern thing. Ethnic minorities so often are suspect of having loyalties contrary to the host nation. May or may not be true, but that's what the Pharaoh uses here. And so he then takes that and he turns it into a form of economic oppression. He puts slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities. But, and there's a certain, you can hear the cheers around the campfire as the narrator tells this bit, verse 12, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Exactly. So they worked them even harder and harder and harder and made their lives bitter with hard labor and bricks and mortar and all kinds of work in the fields. And they made their lives merciless. In other words, there's an economic dimension of the exploitation of this ethnic minority as effectively free labor for the host state. And then that moves through to a form of social oppression as the chapter proceeds. When that still fails and Pharaoh cannot, as it were, suppress these people or make them less numerous by this policy of exploitation, he tries another tack, which again is very modern, which is to subvert the community from within. And so he tries to get the Hebrew midwives on his side and to get them to do his dirty work for him. And he instructs them that when they attend a Hebrew birth, if it's a boy, they're to kill it. If it's a girl, they're to let it live. And then you have, again, this marvelously humorous moment in the narrative, I think, when the midwives answer Pharaoh, well, you see, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, all those wimpish Egyptian women. I mean, that's pretty insulting in the first. They're vigorous, and they give birth before the midwives arrive. That's a pretty cushy job to have, wasn't it? I mean, every time you got called, you were never needed, say these midwives. And the joke is, of course, that Pharaoh believes them. And there's this sense of the hoodwinking of Pharaoh. But if there is any humor here, it's very quickly dispelled, because what happens next is that Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every boy that is born you must now throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. This is state-sponsored genocide. This is a government order to the Egyptian people, get the Israelites, okay? We're effectively going to stop them reproducing by killing the baby boys. And you can imagine the kind of suffering and fear and anxiety that caused, not only as it was happening, but even in the anticipation of it happening. When a woman becomes pregnant, she's got 9 months to wait. And in the days before scanning, 9 months to know whether it's a boy or a girl. 9 months of fear that what ought to have been a moment of great joy, it's a boy, becomes a moment of great horror. Who's going to find out that it's a boy and put it to death? And so there's this social oppression, but there's also, fourthly, a spiritual dimension to all of this, which we should not miss. And it is important that we put all of this together in the story. Because what was happening between Egypt and the Hebrews was not merely political non-freedom, economic exploitation, social interference with their family life, and effectively genocide. It also has a spiritual dimension, inasmuch as the Israelites are serving Pharaoh. Now, the language of serving is interesting here. Well, look, there's my triangle before. Can I erase that? I'm sure you like little bits of Hebrew from time to time. And I don't think I've written it there, have I? No. Is this the... That's a flip chart marker. I don't want that. I'm scared stiff when I use pens and whiteboards, because you're using a wrong one and you're... dry cloth, that was it, yeah. It's the word avoda. Can you read that way at the back? The verb is avad. The verb is avad, and the noun is avodah. And it can mean slavery and working and being a servant. It's also used of worship. Avodah can mean worship in many contexts. It's used of both. And so when God says in Exodus 4:22, Israel is my firstborn son, let my son go, that they may avad me. You will find in the English translations that they alternate between either let my people go that they may serve me, or let my people go that they may worship me. And the reason for the variant translations is because the word actually means both. And what it is saying is that being in a servant-serving state to Pharaoh is in a sense giving an allegiance to Pharaoh which was incompatible with being the people of God who were actually supposed to be avad God, avodah to him. And so the problem for God with the Hebrews is not that they were slaves and needed to be liberated so much as that they were slaves of the wrong master. They were slaves and servants of Pharaoh and needed to be released into the service and worship of the living God. And that was a spiritual reality, not just a geographical one. It wasn't just a matter of getting the Israelites out of Egypt. It was also a matter of getting the Israelites to Mount Sinai, where they would enter into covenant relationship with Yahweh, the God of their fathers. Another way in which this is expressed is that when God talks about the great encounter between himself and Pharaoh that we will look at more tomorrow under the concept of idolatry, he speaks about it being a battle between himself and not just the Pharaoh, but all the gods of Egypt. This is Exodus 12, verse 12. Exodus 12, verse 12. I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt because I am the Lord. This is a spiritual conflict between Yahweh, the living God, and all the claimed gods, spurious, usurping gods, including Pharaoh himself of Egypt. So what this means then is that in the Exodus, God's idea of doing a spot of redemption in the world, and he's going to redeem this people in the world, it is comprehensive. It involves all of these dimensions of their bondage, all the situations of their need. And what I'm wanting to argue here, and we'll then draw this to a close, you can go away and think and talk about it, is that therefore to rightly interpret the Exodus in relation to our theology, our gospel, our mission, our understanding of redemption, we need to take all of these dimensions into how we structure it. There is a temptation, or there is a danger in some usages and interpretations of the Exodus to swing in one of two directions. One is that we spiritualize it. Now, I hope you don't get me wrong here, because I'm not wanting in any sense to question or deny what I'm just about to say. Okay? I was brought up as a child, I remember it in Sunday school, in the very fine teaching that I had in a Presbyterian church in Belfast, to make the link between the Exodus and the cross. And the link was this, that in the Exodus, God saved the Israelites from slavery to Egypt. And in the cross, God saves us from slavery to sin. Now, both of those statements are quite true. And that's why I'm saying I'm not wanting to question this. The point is that when you've done that, you're effectively saying the only dimension of the Exodus that has any meaning for us now, because we're in Christ, is that it is a kind of picture book of spiritual salvation from sin. I need to get released from slavery to sin, and the cross, the blood of Christ, as it were, takes me from slavery into freedom. My sin is paid for, the debt is gone, I'm lifted out of bondage into freedom. That's what the cross does for me. That's a spiritual solution to a spiritual problem, and the Exodus gives us a nice picture of it back in the Old Testament. That's what I'm meaning by spiritualizing of it. What I'm saying is that that is true, but it's not the whole truth. It's not even necessarily the best way of looking at the Exodus itself, because it doesn't quite fit, does it? This is what struck me later. Because it is true to say that on the cross, Christ delivers me from slavery to the bondage to my own sin. But in the Exodus, God did not deliver the Israelites from slavery to their sin. He delivered them from slavery to the sin of others, the sin and the oppression of the Egyptians. It was a deliverance out of a bondage that was being imposed upon them externally. God liberated them from the evil, from the actions of oppressors in the Exodus. And therefore, in a sense, the parallel to that in the New Testament, I would argue now, is not so much my deliverance from my personal sin as the cosmic victory of the cross over the power of evil that oppress human life. God's victory over principalities and powers and all that oppresses and destroys. The victory of the cross over Satan, principalities, powers, death, all that oppresses human life has been attacked and destroyed, triumphed over by the blood of Christ on the cross. So, yes, there is a spiritual dimension to this. But it leaves out all the other dimensions of the fact that in the Exodus, God really delivered real human beings from real slavery to real slave lords on real turf in a real political situation, brought them out of that and took them into another land. There is a historical reality to this stuff, which is in danger of just being, as it were, completely dissolved if all you do is turn it into a nice little picture of spiritual salvation. So that's one side. The other temptation, of course, at the opposite extreme, is those who would want to use the Exodus as a picture or a model of political or social or economic liberation, but without any concern for the spiritual dimension of people coming into a faith relationship with the living God. In our terms, through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, or in other words, through evangelism. And as you're probably aware, there are some forms of there are, of course, a whole variety of liberation theologies, and some of them are more evangelical than others. I wouldn't want to lump them all together by any means. There are many varieties of them. But there are some which would argue more or less like this. Look, from the Exodus we know that the God of the Bible is the God who cares about the poor, who is against the oppressor, and who wants justice to be done. So therefore, wherever human beings act for justice, to liberate the oppressed, to bring about deliverance from economic or political bondage, there is God in action. There is God's redemption at work. And so the redemptive work of God can be seen, they would argue, in action for justice, in political advocacy, in economic uplift and community development, and working for the poor, and so on. And the danger there is that although, again, I would say that is true, it is part of the message of the Exodus, that if that then omits the fact that God didn't just bring the Israelites out of Egypt and wave bye-bye in the wilderness and say, there you are, you're free, go and do as you please. He brought them out of Egypt to bring them to himself, to bring them into covenant relationship, a relationship in which they would need to know about their own sinfulness, in which there would need to be a sacrificial system, in which they would understand the relationship between themselves and a loving, gracious, holy God. And for us as Christians, of course, that means bringing people into a relationship with God in which there is faith and repentance and trust, which, of course, in Christian terms we would call evangelism, bringing people to the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ and to faith in him. So what I'm trying to say here is we need to hold these things together. Sad thing is that so often Christians polarize over this. And they're either all for evangelism and, all this social action stuff's very dodgy and suspect, or they're all into the social action stuff and concern for the poor, and, well, don't embarrass me with evangelism. And I'm wanting to say either of those two extremes has got hold of part of what the Bible says. Neither of them is unbiblical, but both of them are only partially biblical. They are less than the whole picture of what the Bible describes as the redemption that God has accomplished for us. So let's be holistic in our understanding of mission based on the holistic understanding of the Exodus. Now I'm going to have to stop there and leave you.